Hello, hello, hello. This is Jay Frost speaking to you from, of course, Command Central at the Philanthropy Mastermind series. Really happy to welcome you today to a special edition of Frontlines of Social Good, our weekly show about the news and views on the field of philanthropy and fundraising. And today, we are really lucky to be able to talk about the biggest story, of course, every year, and do it with several of the people who know that story better than just about anybody in the field itself. And that is, of course, Giving USA and the results. So we want to welcome you to this conversation, but we will be covering a lot of territory. So I'm going to invite you to do a couple things right now. One is to just say hello to one another in the chat. I won't even be able to greet all of you right now because of time limitations, but at least you'll be able to see that you all are here. Maybe which part of the country or the world that you're from, perhaps which organization you're with. Just let us know that you are here. I know that our guests today will be really appreciative of that. So thank you already. You can see Reed warming up that space. Thank you, Reed. And everybody joining him, we appreciate that very much. We also have Q&A for you. Please use the Q&A for your questions today. We will store them up and then we will share them with our guests toward the end of our presentation and conversation to get through just a top level look at Giving USA 2025. Which, as you probably know, takes a look, in fact, at 2024. But that's not so far in a rearview mirror, and we can learn a lot from it, and we will today from our guests, who are, of course, are Roger Alley, who is the chair of AFP, and Rasheeda Childress, who is the senior editor at the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and Sarah TeDesco, the COO at DonorSearch, and among other things, also the sponsor of this entire series. So if you're interested in everything that we do here, you can learn more about it and probably a lot more about your donors over at DonorSearch.net. And while you're there enjoying yourself, you can take a look at the resources tab for recordings in this series, including sessions like this one, which we do every single year, but not like today's because we have these guests. So before I begin, I want to, of course, introduce to those who are unfamiliar with it, what we're going to be talking about today, and that is Giving USA. And for 70 years, Giving USA, the annual report on philanthropy, has been published as a comprehensive annual report, again, on what's going on in philanthropy in the United States. Now, of course, there's a lot going on here, and there's a lot to be studied. And so that process of building that data has developed over time. And today, the Giving Institute, in cooperation with the Giving USA Foundation, are partnered with, of course, the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy and at Indiana University, which is responsible for the accumulation of all this data and the writing of this report. It's quite extensive. There's a slide deck that if you decide to subscribe to this report, which we hope you will do, you'll find that there's a slide deck that has over 45 slides. We will not be sharing all those with you today. It would simply be too much time to do so. But we will give you a top-level view in the next few minutes. And what I will do, in fact, is open up some of that now to share with you. Right? So if you all would just ignore those notes, you won't see many notes in this deck. But it is a deck that was developed by, once again, the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And these slides were originally presented by Una Ostley, who is, of course, the chair in philanthropy at the school. And she was kind enough to give us kind of a digest of the top-level look at this information. So what we're going to do is divide that up into 3 sections today so that our guests can comment on what they have seen here as well as what they've read over the past few days. They had an early look at some of this data. And then we will turn again to questions from you after we go through these 3 sections. So we'll begin right now with version. So the first thing we're going to look at is charitable giving, which, as you may have seen in the reports just this morning, now totals $592.5 billion in 2024. That's giving reached through current dollars. In other words, what things cost today. When adjusted for inflation, of course, 2021 remains the biggest year of giving on record. And as you can see in this bar chart, if you looked along the blue bars, you can see 2021 right here, where you probably see my cursor moving. And that was, of course, the year following the dawn of the pandemic, when so many people came to the fore and provided support in a variety of areas where we will see, in fact, through this data, a few changes have occurred since that time. Now, additionally, what you can see here are two things: not only the inflation adjusted dollars, but their current dollars. So if you were to look at this and just look at the dollars over time, and Giving USA has been doing this once again for 70 years, you'll see that some of those figures in earlier years would have seemed quite small by comparison. But if you do inflation adjust, you'll see that there's some consistency of both generosity over the generations, but also growth. There are exceptions in certain years, as you saw in 2021, but this is a pretty robust year. Now, once again, if we reach that $592.5 billion figure, that's I would suppose you could say good news to reach almost $600 billion. The question is, where is it coming from? Total giving lifted by individual and corporate giving, absolutely. We can also see that 3 out of the 4 sources of giving grew in current dollars this year. So just reading that chart for you, or doing that also for listeners, we can see the total right there. But individual growth has been significant, and foundations also, and corporations very significantly, almost 9%. What does that mean? Well, we've seen one area, bequests, which have seen a decrease, but otherwise it's been a significant increase over time. Total growth in 2024 reflects a long-run average, as I alluded to before. Total giving grew at rates similar to the 40-year average growth of giving. And why is that? As we'll discuss together as a panel in a moment, it's largely attributable to financial markets having a strong year. And what you will see in the larger set of Giving USA results is that there is a pattern where the S&P 500's growth can be tracked alongside the then subsequent growth in giving. So the market goes up, and that's an opportunity for people to make gifts of stock or other appreciated assets, and that's reflected then in the overall growth of giving. So as is mentioned in this slide, financial markets had a strong year, and while most other economic indicators grew at a healthy 2-3% rate after adjusting for inflation. So a solid economy on stable footing likely contributed to that growth, and financial security is, of course, linked to substantial giving. Now, what about the giving environment itself? Individuals remain the large majority of the giving pie at 66%. Now, for those who have been in the field for any length of time or have looked at these reports previously, you know that this is actually a decrease from 10 years ago, but still a sizable majority. If we were to look back in years past, we might see it's as high as 70% or more of individuals. It's important to note, however, as we'll talk about later, that the foundations, which make up a very substantial part of the pie here, are representative of both what might be considered professional foundations, they're staffed, as well as family foundations. And bequests, of course, again, are reflective of individual wishes to make gifts, testamentary gifts. So the other element here that we'll be talking about in a moment are corporations, where we have seen some growth. Individuals as a whole, this has been a discussion point, and I'm sure it will be in just a moment with our panel about both the importance of individual giving, but how it is apportioned, how it has stayed as large as it is, even though as a portion of the pie, it has effectively diminished. As you can see here in the slide, once again, corporate giving is pushed up to 7% of total giving, as high as it's ever been in the past 40 years. But corporate giving is still the smallest share of our tracked resources. So where does this all take us? Individual giving grew amid a strong economy. Giving by individuals grew 8.2% in current dollars, or 5.1% when adjusted for inflation. And with inflation, while still around 3%, was lower than in previous years. Consumer sentiment was up strongly from 2023, but still low historically, so that has a dampening effect. And mega giving, which is something I think most of us in philanthropy and fundraising have been very interested in for a long time, and I know that all of our panelists can come on this, it was close to $12 billion last year, 11.72 billion, comparable to other recent years. And by the way, we should define some of these terms. And mega giving here, in terms of this report, refers to gifts of $600 million or more. So with that, what I'd like to do is turn to our panelists and see if we can have a little bit of a discussion about what you're looking at so far. So once again, welcome to, as I see them on my screen, Sarah, Rasheeda, and Roger. I really appreciate your being here. What are some of the first takeaways, and I'll do this in alphabetical order, that you have from these preliminary kind of top level results? Roger?
For me, I'm not surprised that individual giving grew, because that is by far the largest source of giving. I think what's important is that with the stock market and having such a healthy economy last year, we had individuals who continued to give large gifts, sometimes through donor advised funds, through other gifts of stock. So that is attributed there. The second observation is that with corporations in particular, the tech sector had a strong performance. And I think that's what we saw in particular with that increase in corporate giving. And I would say the last is around foundation giving, again, attributed to a very strong, healthy asset base and the ability to give more grants to grantees.
Rasheeda, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key takeaway is really just that it was a strong 2024, and particularly at the end of 2024, which I think is going to hopefully be a help as people head into 2025. I think we saw that a little bit in the beginning of the year when there was all those federal funding cuts and people were going to donors and saying, "Can you help?" And people were giving gifts out of donor advised funds. They were giving gifts out of appreciated stock assets. So I think that's a key element.
And Sarah?
Yeah. Thanks, Jay. And I can see all the chats. We're going to try and get those slides fixed for you so that you can see in the full mode. I think there's just a heavy load issue on the back end. But when we take a look at the charitable giving for 2024, it really does highlight, what Rasheeda and Roger were talking about, is that it was a healthy economy. Right? People were feeling good. There were donations that were being made. People were spending. We also saw people were feeling, maybe more removed from the COVID pandemic area. So we saw some of those nonprofits were able to recover at a more active rate. And then there's also this IT technology sector boom, where there's more focus on the AI side of things. There's more focus on how technology can help us in different ways. And, when we look at it in those terms, it really does highlight this really great return. 2025 is different, as we all know, and as we talked a little bit about, and I'm sure we'll get into more depth there. But yeah, it looks really great from 2024 standpoint comparatively.
Just as a historical note here, Sarah, you and I talked about this before we began today. When you see the individual portion, what is your reaction to that? There's been a large discussion in the field about, are we seeing a lack of generosity? But these top line numbers are really very strong, and we see large mega gifts. So what are you interpreting from this?
Yeah, it's definitely something that requires some attention. So we've seen the donation dollar sizes increase, right? So the donation amount has increased, but we've seen the percentage of donors decline. So what that means is, some of those results are getting skewed by some of those mega donors, but also really requires nonprofits and for us to be super focused on the kinds of engagement that we're doing and to be really precise in who we're talking to, as well as, making sure that the content that we're delivering is relevant to the donor. So making sure that we are personalized, that we are delivering on that expectation of what the donor needs, what they want. Because if you think about it as a smaller percentage of group that are able to contribute, you know, that just means that your time has to be much more efficient and effective.
And I don't know if either you, Rasheeda, or you, Roger, have thoughts on this, because again, that's been a talking point and kind of a debate about whether or not we're seeing a decline in overall generosity, but we're seeing some positive news here.
Yeah, I will say I've talked to a lot of people about this idea of the decline in generosity. And it's not even that people are less generous. People want to be generous and they want to give. I think, you know, right now we're competing against a couple of issues. There is the belief among some people that, you know, there are all these mega donors. We hear about the gifts all the time. So people think, well, I don't really need to give. And so you've got to compete against that. And there is also, I talked to someone who does mass fundraising, and they were like, it's really hard to get people to feel like they can make a difference. And so some people just are not giving, not because they don't feel like giving. They feel like, what is my little $5 going to do? It's not going to help. There are all these mega donors. So I think sort of combating those two things is kind of where people need to stand right now.
Thank you. Roger, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think what we've seen as well is a decline in giving is related to the decline in trust. And I think that is particularly true when you see that there are fewer donors giving at the lower level. So those are gifts that are under $100. And as Sarah said, you know, the large gifts tend to overshadow this startling concern that many fundraising professionals have. And part of that is, you know, perhaps it's a lack of trust in some organizations, but also with political and economic pressures and organizations having to really uplift and show the importance of their mission and remembering the back to basics and the importance of stewardship. So just as important, that $35 to complete the full thank you process and to show where the dollars are going, as you would with a mega $6 million plus donor, because that is going to shift that trend and increase that level of trust. And collectively, we all have a role to play in that.
Yeah.
Thank you all for all of it. Oh, do you have another
comment? I was just gonna, you know, Roger, the point about the trust within nonprofits, I think that is something that's extremely relevant, especially for 2025, right? As we've seen different focuses on nonprofits and some of the headlines out there that question the legitimacy of nonprofits or question where those funds are going. I think if you're, you know, as we all take these things seriously, it's really important that you are demonstrating ROI, that you are demonstrating effectiveness, and that you're appealing to maybe even some of those high net worth donors and making sure that they understand that those dollars really count. And the $5 donors, Rasheeda, that you're talking about too, you know, creating that culture of philanthropy, making sure that those donors feel important too, and that their money counts just as much as somebody else's.
Okay. So now, you've probably even read this slide by now, but individual giving, we talked about earlier. Now we're going to move on to giving by foundations and corporations, the institutional piece that did see some significant growth in the last few years, particularly among corporations. In this view, for last year, giving by foundations reached a current dollar high and exceeded $100 billion for a third consecutive year. That was boosted by strong market performance, which is elevated foundation giving. And in the last 3 years, we've seen large and steady giving in that sector. So you can follow the line and you can see exactly what we mean by that. Those are the current dollars versus the inflation adjusted. Now, strong GDP is also, and profits are also responsible for helping corporations reach a record high. And this is something that I know we can dig into further because companies give in lots of different ways, and you'll see that information reflected in greater depth in the report itself. But just looking at the top level view, corporate giving continues to show the strongest recent term growth among all the sectors that are followed here by Giving USA. The 5- and 10-year annualized growth rates for corporate giving are the highest among all sources. And giving by corporations remains, however, the smallest portion of total giving at 7%, even though it saw that 9.1% growth or 6% after adjustment for inflation. Giving by corporations held steady at 1.1% of pre-tax profits, which I guess brings up the question I wanted to ask all of you, and I won't take the slide away right now so we can take a look at this as we discuss it. But there's been discussion for a long time about what is the role of companies and corporate social responsibility. And of course, that's been changing and modifying as they respond to pressures from their stakeholders, their stockholders, and the public, and even the government. What are your thoughts as you look at this and then think about how, if at all, corporate giving or corporate investment in the community might have changed and how it's reflected in these numbers? Let's start with you, Rasheeda. What do you think? Oh, wait.
You want the role, the role, or how it's changed?
Well, take either.
Well, I think I was talking to someone with the chief executives for corporate purpose, and they were saying, corporations, they want to be a part of their community. These are places that they live, their employees live there. So I think corporations are always going to want to be giving back somewhat. Um, I think, last year was a really good year for corporations, corporate giving, according to Giving USA. And even when I was talking to the people at the chief executives, they were saying the tech sector really drove that because some of the other sectors didn't have as great of corporate give back. So I think corporate giving is a part of American giving. I think it's going to be a tough year this year. The administration has made some priorities that they do not want to be sort of funded. And so corporations have kind of been following suit. People have said DEI is not being funded, things related to immigration are not being funded. So that's going to be a concern. And also there is, here it says 1.1% of pre-tax profits went to charities. Now a new proposal says that if you don't, that's sort of the cap. You have to donate at least that much before you get a charitable contribution. So that may change how corporations think about things moving forward. But I think for 2024, it was a good year, and it was good news for people. And the question is what's going to happen this year.
Right. And that is an open question. Sometimes it's hard to predict future results based on past performance in some cases. Roger, what about you? Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, the bar charts show that 2024 marked a new high for corporate giving, but what I've seen as well is that corporations are being more mission focused, so they're aligning their charitable giving with a focus that is important to them and their employees. So, for example, you might have a focus on climate change, and that is kind of where all their corporate donations are going. Or they pick 2 or 3 areas that support the overall nonprofit sector. So, there's an emphasis on mental health supports and food insecurity. And that is a trend that we've seen actually during the pandemic that became even stronger and that continued. So I feel that that is also something that we're going to see more of in 2025. I think the important piece as well is the importance of the sector, the corporate sector, and the commitment to giving. I think what I would like to see is how we can engage more volunteers within the corporate sector because we are all faced with that challenge and not just at the board table, but individuals who can be advocates for our mission. So I think that is a piece that we have to think about as grants are scarce and there are cutbacks, in particular with operating grants. How can we have mitigating strategies to actually help us? And I think that's one of them.
Sarah, any thoughts on the corporate before we move to foundations for a second?
I agree with Rasheeda and Roger. And yeah, when you take a look at the corporate giving, there is a focus on social good, social impact. If you're looking at some of the younger donors or younger generations, it's, cool for an organization to give back. So when you think about corporations and how they're marketing those efforts, I think there might be more of a trend there, and in alignment with some of the policies that are written or some of the regulation regarding some of those predefined donations that have to be made.
And we just kind of glossed over the foundations, but they're actually a pretty big deal, both in terms of their scope, but also the growth of foundations over time. One chart that we're not showing here because we're not giving you the big slide deck that would take a couple of hours to do in depth is the growth of nonprofits. So there's also a competitive element, but also that means that there are a lot of good organizations doing great work in their communities, but it's grown substantially from around 1.1 million to 1.6 million in the last, I think it's the last decade, or since 2013, if I'm not mistaken. And similarly, there's a lot of foundations that have grown. So I don't have the precise number in front of me right now, but it's substantial growth over time. Any thoughts about where foundations are taking their support and its relative steady growth?
I can jump in. Some of the trends we're seeing with foundations in particular is using some of their designated funds and spending down those funds in particular for causes that support operations. And we're seeing that trend in particular at the end of 2024 and into 2025. We're also seeing foundations that are focused on what I would call kind of the basic needs of community. So basic needs in terms of homelessness and food insecurity and issues that are unique to communities that may be in terms of a climate crisis. So those are some trends that we've seen and those shifts and designated funds within foundations. I think the good news in this report is that, almost 20% of the total giving for 2024 come from foundations. And that is significant. And in particular, last year was a really great year for the stock market. So in particular, the asset base and the values of those assets allowed foundations to give more. So I think that's both a plus, but also a caution as we look at what might shift, potentially might shift for this year as we go forward.
Yeah, thank you for that. And in fact, there's a footnote in the larger report that talks about how the presence or absence of the grant making of one very large foundation can have a big impact on these results. So, for example, according to Candid's most recent foundation giving forecast survey, cumulative grant payments made by survey respondents declined by 8.2% from fiscal year 2023 to fiscal year 2024 in current dollars. But much of that decline was attributed to one large community foundation that decreased its giving. So if we do see some foundations double their grant making, which we've heard discussions about in this last year, and maybe Rasheeda, you could comment on that. I'm not sure. I know it's been covered in the Chronicle. Then we might see these numbers, not just be flat, but rise depending upon what they decide to do in this next year.
Yeah, I think it's foundations, they sort of do their giving on a community look back and sort of decide how much we're going to give. And if past years have been great, they should typically give more. So we've had a lot of really good years recently. And so foundation giving hopefully should be up this year. But you're right, some organizations are winding down. The Gates Foundation is going to be winding down over the next couple decades. So that's going to make a difference. And as they wind down, if they give these sort of big payouts, that's going to boost giving one year, and then the next year it's going to drop off. Just from the people we've been talking to this year, foundation giving has been a little bit up and down, where some foundations are sort of upping their payouts in order to meet some of the challenges we're facing this year. And other foundations are saying, we're going to work with the people we already work with, but we're not really going to entertain new things until we sort of figure out what's happening, right, and all these changes sort of level out so we can figure out where our money makes the most sense to put. And so hopefully, I don't know, we may see more of that this year, more people sort of waiting and seeing before they jump in with money.
Sure. And I am going to move on, but Sarah, I want to make sure if you had a comment about this, that I made space.
I think when we were reviewing it and really digesting it, one of the points that was brought up was the unrestricted giving. So foundations moving away from the restrictions that they had in the past. So offering more of that flexibility to nonprofits, as well as, encouraging some of that resilience, some of that movement, being able to actually apply those donations there. So just wanted to bring that point in as well.
Thank you for that. Moving into this next little group here, looking at top level results. Strong GDP and profits helped corporations reach a record high. Again, that's just revisiting what we were talking about on the corporate front. And you saw already that corporations are holding steady at 1.1% of pre-tax profits. Here we go. This is something I know interests everybody who's with us live and watching this recording later. It's not just how much money, but it's where it's going. And I think this is one of the things that interests most of us. So for a moment, I'm just going to let you read this. And I'll share it verbally, but I know that we all need to digest it. In the same way that the amount of giving from individuals, the percentage of giving from individuals is so material to how we think about what we do, where that money is going is very material. And before we began today, I think we were even chatting informally about, for example, religious giving and its importance. We know historically, as you can see right here in this chart, 1984, that religious giving was, and I'm having trouble reading it myself, but 62%. And in the last Giving USA report, the one just released today, last year, it was 23%. So it's a very significant decline, even though overall giving is up. Human services saw a very significant increase over time, 14%. Education is important, but if you looked at it year over year, we're not looking at a year over year chart, but that has seen a small decline. Health is at 10%. Gifts to grant making is foundations 11%. That kind of echoes some of what we were talking about a moment ago. And there are also all the way through here, giving, for example, to individuals, which is something we don't necessarily talk a lot about, but it can be quite important. And that is dealt with in depth in the report. So before I say anything else, I want to invite people in the chat to go ahead and comment on this so we can revisit that later. If you have questions about it, put those in the Q&A, but now turn to our panelists and just ask them their response, their reaction to this. Sarah, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think this is probably this is one of the slides that I look forward to the most. I think it's really compelling and interesting to look at the trends over time. And, I think it's really a reflection on how the interest for each generation changes over time, and also what's important from, an economic standpoint or, administration standpoint, what is being impacted. So when we take a look at religion, I was sharing with Jay earlier, as I can remember different conferences that I went to, 10, 15 years ago, where religion made up 70% of the pie. And then today, we see that it's less than a quarter, it's 23%. So, over those 10, 15 years, we always talked about how there were less donors that were giving to that section or that segment of religion. But now here we are today, and it seems like almost overnight that religion has received less donations. And I think that's really important because eventually time catches up and eventually we'll see those results. And when we think about the donors and the number of donors potentially declining as well, it's really important that we are adjusting and thinking about how we're communicating with them and what sort of actions we're taking from a nonprofit organization standpoint, and what are we doing to ensure that our mission doesn't suffer, some of these consequences. And I'll add one last thing too, is, if you are in a religious organization, this is not supposed to be super depressing, but it is an opportunity for you to think about, well, how else can you communicate with folks? How can you get people back engaged with your organization? What are you going to be doing to appeal to some of those younger generations, and maybe aligning your mission with some of these other focus areas like human services or education? What can you do to sort of combat that?
Rasheeda, would you like to take the next?
Yeah, I'll just add, when I talked to the people over at Giving USA about this, one of the things that they mentioned is that, religion just includes those houses of worships. And so, if you're talking about religion, a lot of people use their faith to inform their giving. And so they may, go to church, but then they donate to a homeless shelter, and one of the things. And so one of the people we interviewed for our story is a church, and they had a pretty good year. And he said, we sort of doubled down on the things that we thought our congregation was interested in, and that was youth development and housing for people in the community. And they talked about that a lot at church, and they got sort of a boost in giving. So I will say that some of it's just fewer people going to the religious things, but also people are donating to other organizations. And I think Compassion International, who we talked to, they had a record sort of breaking 2024. They're a religious but international organization. So all that giving is going to fall under international, even though all of most of the people who donate to them are deeply involved in the church and that kind of thing. So I think some of the religious giving has been sort of spread around to the other causes.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Roger.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is, we know that individuals that are making smaller gifts give to 5 to 7 different causes. So to Rasheeda's point and Sarah's, you have those individuals who are giving, $50, $60 or even less, but times 5 or 6 different organizations. And that's where you see the pieces of this pie distributed differently than it was 40 years ago. I think the other aspect as well is that donors are interested in causes that are close to home, but also international causes. So when we see crises worldwide, we see increased giving in NGOs, and we see increased giving through, whether it's the American Red Cross or the United Way. And I think that's certainly been a shift over time, that donors are giving both locally and internationally, and they're giving to 5+ different types of organizations.
Right. Yes. This is really important that as we look at each of these categories, there's a lot happening underneath the hood of each of them. So I really appreciate all of your comments about that. And just moving right along here, the sectors that grew the most in 2024 also were recovering from 2023 declines, which may be one of the most fascinating parts of this study, that giving to education, health, arts, environment, animals reached record highs, even when adjusted for inflation. And giving to public society benefit, international education, all experienced double-digit growth in current dollars. And each of them had weaker years in 2023. So if you were to look at this over a 40-year period, it'd be even more instructive. But even just looking at these, as you can see in the bar chart, 2023, 2024, it's a very significant change. Any thoughts on what this might be reflective of, and whether or not, maybe I hesitate to ask you to make crystal ball predictions, but if you have any comments about where this may be headed, I know that the audience would welcome those as well. And Roger, you will be leaving us in 5 minutes, so I'll let you have the first word.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. So, I think public sector or society benefit, like the United Ways of the world and other larger organizations, you see that donors are giving through donor advised funds. And I think that is certainly a trend, and we've seen that increase in giving. So it's a big plus. I think our challenge there is knowing who the donors are and how you store those gifts over time so you can build stronger relationships. And I think we've seen many major capital campaigns that have either come to a conclusion, or we've had mega gifts, and I think in particular in the education sector. And the last point is with on the international front, we've had some big crises over the last year. I think there were a dozen or so, and that definitely tends to increase giving, both from smaller gifts and from larger ones as well.
Thank you. Sarah, would you like to?
Yeah, I think, this really goes to the point of what's important to the next generation of donors that are coming through, the people that are actually making those contributions. For people, we've talked about it as a group, thinking about 2025, how would this potentially change moving forward? I think we can take some of the facts that we learned during COVID. We saw some rage giving, right? We saw some people that were giving to organizations that they felt needed those dollars based on different administration effects or impacts. And I think we've already seen some of that too in the higher ed space. Case in point, Harvard education, right? We've seen an influx of donors that have given to them. So I would not be surprised if we saw similar results in 2025. People are going to take into control what they can, and we might see this through some of the donations.
Thank you. Yes. Rasheeda, do you have thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, I agree with sort of Sarah and Roger. I don't have a whole lot to add. I think international, there was a lot of things happening last year that people
Mhm.
drove people out to donate. And public society benefit is where a lot of the DAFs are housed. The commercial DAFs like Fidelity and Vanguard and Schwab. So you get some giving into that.
Right. And that's been growing significantly. And we don't have a DAF category in this report. And that's one of the questions people ask a lot about. And there may be questions in the Q&A, which we'll be getting to in a minute. We have our last slide now before we take these slides off the screen. Invite you to go ahead and subscribe for this. This is the purpose of this is not to sell Giving USA. It's because we really believe that this data is important. And so you will find a link in the chat where you can do that. And I believe there's a discount right now for those who are interested in doing so early. But the main point is you'll want to be able to go through all of this. You won't be able to have Roger, Rasheeda, and Sarah with you as you do, but at least you'll be able to have that by your side throughout the year and make plans informed by the past. So I want to make sure I say thank you to Roger for being here today. I know he'll probably disappear in a moment. As you all know, again, the chair of AFP, AFP is so important to many of us also to help us digest and understand not just this data, but how to apply the lessons and that we're getting from all the studies that are done in this sector. So I want to thank you, Roger, for that. And if you have any comment on this slide before you run out the door to catch your airplane, I'd welcome that. This is one, it's again, is the last one. This is 7 of the 9 recipient categories grew even after adjusting for inflation. Those are everything except for religion. Religion is one. I know we covered this before, but once again, if there's any thought you have as you run out the door, please feel free to offer it.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize, I think when we see that increase in the public society benefit, I think it is those commercial DAFs. And I think the second is that religion is still the largest percentage of giving. So it tells me, and I know that individuals are still contributing to those places of worship and the importance of giving based on faith.
Thank you. Yes. So Rasheeda, any kind of last thoughts on this one before we turn to the audience?
Yeah, I would say that, the changes, these are inflation adjusted versus current dollars. So that change to religion, we at the Chronicle of Philanthropy, we often are looking at the inflation adjusted, but very few people go and say, when I give, I'm going to give an inflation adjusted amount of money. So, people are giving maybe a little bit more than they did last year. And so in current dollars, it's like a 2.4% increase. So I think when people look at their numbers, even when charities are looking at their numbers, they're not thinking, should I inflation adjust it? They're thinking, did I get more this year than the year before? And so I think, when looking at that, I think it just shows that people are trying to at least give at somewhat the same amount or similar. Though, when you actually inflation adjust it, you realize those dollars just didn't go as far.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. That's a great observation. Sarah?
Yeah, I agree. I think, what Roger was talking about earlier is building that culture of philanthropy, right, from a religious organization. And Rasheeda, pointing out also the fact that you need to be, some of that is actually being physical in person and how so much of that has changed over time. If you look at, again, this sort of technology evolution, it's really important that we are creating different ways for folks to give. So, and I, during COVID, when I attended our, Catholic service virtual, and I was looking to see how I could make a donation, there wasn't a way to do that. There was no easy way to do that. And of course, they've changed over time, but I think, right now we're in what some might call a time of crisis. So it's really important that we're remembering some of the things that we built on in COVID and bringing that to this period. And if there were some best practices that maybe your organization stopped because you didn't feel like you needed to sustain it anymore because times had cooled off, maybe it's important to revisit that and bring that back into focus and think about how can we make it easy for our donors to make a contribution, what has changed, how do we make sure that our communication and messaging is relevant to them.
Yes, that's such a terrific segue, I'm sure, for the conversation with everyone who is here with us live, but it's also one where we can start to take this information and go in a forward-looking manner and think, well, what are the strategies we can apply so that if we find ourselves on the end of something that hasn't grown the way we would have liked, what can we do to adjust for that, as well as to look forward in the places where we have seen growth and make sure that we can capitalize on it. May not be the best word, but that's the right concept. So I'm just going to go back sequentially. The first comment that we had come in was from Lori earlier, saying that we know that the percentage of those who itemize dropped to approximately 8% after 2027 tax reform. Given that GUSA bases its state on itemized returns, what do you predict? Always dangerous when we ask for predictions. What do you predict the impact on data will be if the current bill under consideration, but this is a long one, which raises the joint itemization eligibility from 25 to 40K, what percentage of the population will we actually be analyzing? By the way, if something gets into the nuts and bolts of the analysis itself, it may be very difficult for our panelists to answer, but we'll go ahead and we'll honor the questions and we'll see, and we can always turn people over, as we always should, to the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy for additional information. But do either of you have a thought on, maybe in general terms, what this tax reform might potentially do? Are you discussing that in either of your realms?
I think, yeah, I think, the impact would be that the pool could drop even further, right? You would have less people that were actually making those donations, and an additional, point of that could be the impact of a shrinking middle class again, right? So we talk about this often, and it's, again, goes to the fact of, if you're a gift officer and if you're in fundraising, you need to be precise about who you're talking to. And when you have a shrinking middle class, what that means is that you need to focus on people that can and will make a difference. And right now it's even more exaggerated, I would say, or at least it's more prominent when we look at the differences between our middle class and those that are the ultra high net worth. So it could just be a signal that it would drop even further.
Right. Rasheeda, is this an issue that you're following personally? I know the Chronicle looks at it a lot.
Yeah, we've I wrote a story. The Lilly School did a report on looking at how giving dropped after that first sort of tax change, and I was really kind of shocked by how many people it really mattered that they got the tax break and they stopped giving when they didn't get it. And so I think if you move more people out of itemizing to where they can get that deduction, it's probably going to have an impact. I don't know how big or how small. I won't predict that, but based on their previous study, I would say it's probably going to have an impact.
We had a question also about mega donors, and if you'd share insights on tax codes. You don't have to get into the weeds of that, but to include any changes that may have contributed to these large numbers of mega donors. Any thoughts on what's the root of all these mega donors, not just this year, but maybe over the last few years?
I mean, I think, it's some people are basically, you have more people who have billions and billions of dollars and have no place to spend it. I mean, there's no place even if you bought all the toys you wanted to, you're still going to be like, I have a lot of money left over. And people, it's kind of trendy. It's kind of cool to donate and to be sort of lauded in charity. It's kind of, you had, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and this whole giving pledge and this idea of being philanthropic. So I think people do want to be philanthropic, but the mega gifts is because you have all these people who have this money. And I think it's a little bit of that whole idea of we're losing sort of the middle class. Usually you would have more people in the middle class giving smaller gifts and then fewer people who are able to make these big, big, huge gifts. But a lot of it's just the number of billionaires we have.
Yeah.
And we do have a lot. Sarah?
Yeah, I would. It's funny. I did a presentation on this, I think, at an AFP conference a few years ago, and we were talking about, the mega donors and the impact. And it's all good and well as long as they're giving to the causes that are in alignment with you. And when that shifts and there's funding for organizations that are maybe not in alignment with you or not in alignment with maybe the values that you hold, it can be it could be potentially detrimental to a group. And I think that's just something to keep in mind. Again, it's like when you're looking to see what's motivating people around you, it's the money, it's the power, it's all of that. So when you think about a mega donor, ultra high net worth, what sort of influence, what sort of impact can they have? So I think it's just something to be cautious of. But yeah, I think, the philanthropic gratitude, that feeling of greatness that comes along with it, prestige, I think that all of that is pretty relevant.
And one thing that we haven't interrogated today, because we weren't looking at all the data, is a list that they actually have within the report. And this kind of information that you have regularly in the Chronicle. And I know that DonorSearch is integrating into its database of philanthropic gifts, which are these very large gifts, these mega gifts, and who they're from. And some of them are just, of course, to their own foundations, which are legitimate gifts. Those are philanthropic gifts, but it isn't necessarily the money that we'll see today. It may be paid out in a 5% rate for perpetuity, or it could be like, as you were talking about earlier, Rasheeda, where they decide to draw down and pay it out like the Gates Foundation has decided to do. Although that seems to be more the exception than the rule. So that list is in here. And in fact, I think the top one this year that they list is the one from Michael Bloomberg. Isn't that right? So a very significant gift. We have, let me see, questions on corporate donations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A lot on corporate donations, actually. And one had to do with whether corporations are essentially sticking to the same script. They're giving the same things they gave to before, including the same kinds of organizations, or whether there might be ways to encourage them to support not just causes, but individual organizations that they have not chosen to make beneficiaries before. Do either of you have thoughts or have stories to tell about how organizations have managed to introduce themselves effectively to companies that maybe are looking for new ways to support the community, especially at a time when it seems like corporate giving is growing?
Yeah, go ahead. You go ahead.
Yeah, I will say that we did a story on sort of getting corporate support. And a lot of it's sort of, starting local, because companies that are in your area, if they've got a headquarters, if they've got like a big office there, those may be places to try to introduce yourself and try to find alignment. But you want organizations that are aligned with your values. If there is a champion employee, someone who like works there and is, high up, who is in your sphere, who can get you introduced to that corporation, those are some of the ways that people who are not or have not been involved with that company before can get some corporate support, or at least get in front of them to talk about if they align.
Yeah. I would add also that corporations are motivated by profits, right? They're motivated by, the revenue that they're bringing in. So when they're looking at where they're going to make that social impact, or where they're going to, have that corporate good, so to speak, that has to drive some sort of revenue for them. So if you have a company that is standing up for DEI rights, that's something that's important to their employees. That's something that's important to their base. If you see a shift, then maybe they've done a market analysis where potentially it doesn't align with their values. And I think that's important to remember. And, Rasheeda, what you were talking about too, is making sure that you have that good communication, that you do have that alignment, that you are doing the right research, and making sure that you're staying close to those funds, because it could potentially shift just based on influence, I would say.
We've had some questions on something. I don't know if either of you can tackle this, but it's about essentially crowdfunding. So I'm trying to bring a couple questions together. And one was about the importance of these under $100 gifts. We saw in that chart, 3% are gifts to individuals, other individuals. And in the last year, we've seen a number of things happen. One of them is, I think, more of a bringing together of Classy and GoFundMe, for example. There are things like that occurring in the marketplace. Are you seeing trends of how this kind of person-to-person giving is influencing either philanthropy as a whole, or the way people are thinking about it, the ways that they want to engage with the community?
I haven't, oh, you go ahead.
Oh, you can go.
I was just going to say, so we haven't done any sort of study specifically on this, on the peer-to-peer, but it still remains popular. It's something that, any of us could start, right? You have your Facebook page or a GoFundMe page. It is something that, when it's available, it can provide insight, but yeah, I think it's popular. It's a trend that I think we should remain close to, but from our standpoint, we don't have too much information on it. Rasheeda.
Yeah, I will say that Giving Tuesday collects a lot of information on sort of this realm of peer-to-peer giving. And I will say that younger people, the younger generation, they sort of think of that as giving almost like to charity. They think of it in the same vein. So if they have given 15 GoFundMe donations over a year, to them, that may be their charity for the year, and they don't need to go necessarily to, a 501c3 nonprofit. And so I think sort of recognizing that and understanding that will help as organizations try try to court some of these younger donors. And I think Roger had mentioned earlier about this idea of trust. And so some people do have more trust in sort of looking at that person who they know or who a friend of theirs knows and saying, I know that money is going to be put to good use, versus going to a charity where they're like, I'm not really sure what's going to happen to that money.
I think
Right.
that's a great point. Yeah. I was just going to say that trust, that ability to actually connect with the individual versus just giving to an entity can make all the difference.
And it must be hard, frankly, for even the folks at Lilly to tabulate or estimate all the informal giving that's going on around the world, from international transfers from families living, for example, in the US, giving money back to a family in, let's say, Guatemala, to giving at Zakat, people giving during Ramadan, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of that going on around the world in different forms. Maybe a last question from the crowd here, because we always love questions on AI. And that's, what is the current role of artificial intelligence or AI algorithms in choosing which organizations or causes to donate to? I know this is pure conjecture, but are you hearing anything about how people, especially institutional donors, are thinking about or utilizing AI in the same way that maybe individual donors might be, to find the cause of their interest?
I think that, obviously you can't ignore the revolution that we're in. This evolution and revolution. If I were trying to do a quick analysis, I would probably open up ChatGPT and look to see, what impact these nonprofits are making, and what sort of references or recommendations. The beauty of the Gen AI is that it pulls it all together for you and can give you the sources to it. So it is a quick way to understand, a nonprofit and what they're serving.
Right.
Yeah, I would just agree with that. I think some organizations are out there trying to use AI to get a better handle on it. What's happening. So it's hard to know for sure, though.
It is. And it's also hard to know where all this is going. I really appreciate both of you for trying to distill what you've learned, both in these slides, but also the additional dozens of pages before them. Do you have any kind of closing thoughts? If you were just telling people who are thinking about getting this report, what they might learn from it and how they might apply it, what's maybe one major learning that you would be a reason to take a few minutes and read this report? Rasheeda?
Well, I talked to the people at Giving USA for a story that we wrote in the Chronicle, and I would say the one thing that sort of stood out to me in my thoughts was, these gifts that happened in 2024 didn't just happen. They didn't just magically appear. Fundraisers worked hard. They applied a lot of strategies and in order to get this to happen. And so they said, even though 2025 is a very different year, even though we've got a lot of different challenges, they're like, just double down on those tactics and the strategies that you used in 2024 that brought the results that Giving USA showed up in 2024. So if there were things that you were using that were successful last year, double down, keep doing those, keep in contact with people, because you're going to need them this year, because this year is more challenging.
Thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, 100% agree with Rasheeda. I wish I could underline it. It is going to be, it is more challenging in 2025. I think, when we're thinking about this and digesting it, the pieces that are important to us is retention, right? Focusing your retention strategies. It costs more to acquire a new donor than it does to maintain those donors. So keeping them close, making sure that communication is strong and engaged, that you understand what's important to those folks. Meeting your donors' expectations, I think, is also going to be key. So what sort of messaging is important to them, and how do you maintain their interest and demonstrate that ROI, that impact of the dollars that they're giving to you, because it's going to be more important than ever as the trust continues to come into focus.
Thank you. And thank you both so much for taking time to share, especially because you haven't had too much time to look at these results yourselves, but you've certainly given us tremendous insight. I want to thank everybody who's been with us live, asking their questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. However, I'm sure that you will really benefit from checking out Giving USA. Once again, Jack, our producer, has listed GUSA in the chat. You can check that out and hopefully get a copy. I know I do personally, and it's always been beneficial to me. I also want to encourage you to participate in our future shows, not just on this topic, but everything we do every Tuesday for this show, usually on News and Views, but also on Thursdays, like this Thursday when we have our CFRE accredited show, Thursday at 1 p.m. And then, of course, every Friday night when we drop our podcasts, which are interviews with people like Roger, who is in the podcast. This week, you'll hear all about his personal story, where he came from, where he's going, and all the rest. You can get that wherever you like to listen. My thanks to everybody here who has made it possible to have this conversation, especially to our friends at DonorSearch, not just Sarah, but to the entire company, which has been sponsoring this series back to 2016. You can check out more about that at the DonorSearch site, donorsearch.net. Under the resources tab, you'll find all the rest of this stuff. And as you leave today, please fill out the survey so we know what you want to see and hear in the weeks ahead. So till next time, thank you.